Hi everyone. Thanks for joining online this talk today. And we're going to talk about data policies and innovation in SEA. So depending on your background, that may sound like policies can be a boring topic, that government policies can not be so interesting. But actually you will see that in Southeast Asia, we are at a very interesting point in history, and we have many things to explore related to data and related to innovations. So I'm going to try to capture your attention with two very interesting numbers. The first one is that only in 2020, 40 million people came online for the first time. And I really mean like for the first time on internet. 40 million is quite a number. And the growth of internet and the digital economy is just amazing. And the second one is less optimistic. 96% of businesses in Singapore reported a breach between September 2018 and September 2019, so in just a year, as reported by Carbon Black. And I think that you can see that despite the growth of internet, we also have the growth of the threats. And that's obviously very related to data, as most of those breaches were basically data leaked and personal information leaked to malicious. So all of that has the data as the center, because data is the fuel for digital transformation, as put by Singapore government, but as put by actually many people. And today what we're going to try to explore is this link between data, digital, and policies and government. And I'm Xavier Bruhiere. And why I'm relevant to talk about it today is because I'm the VP of data engineering at Lazada for everything related to logistics. And what I do is oversee across the region, across Southeast Asia, all the visibility we have to deliver packages. So I'm basically aware of, and I witness actually, the development of our small businesses and bigger businesses across the Thailand, Vietnam, Singapore, as well as the evolution of the policies of government, because we need to comply with them and we need to live as they evolve. So all of that gives me a pretty good picture of what is happening right now in the region and how we adapt to it and how many organizations adapt to it. And if you don't know Lazada, we are actually just part of the Alibaba group, and we are an e-commerce, basically the leading e-commerce player in the region. And when I've put all the slides together today to talk about data policies and trends and innovations, I realized that what we're going to try to insert today is how do we conciliate digital transformation, business innovations, while still guaranteeing the protection of the consumers. And that's really at the heart of the discussion today, and something I hope you're going to think about. And at the end of the discussion, you're going to walk away with more insights, at least from the SEA, but basically globally about the topic, on how for the coming years we can work together to basically allow more innovations, but also in a sustainable and secure way. And to do that, we're going to just frame rapidly what's the current context of Southeast Asia, basically the small specificities of the region. And once we've done that, we're going to dive into data protection, data openness, and what I call data moonshots, basically the innovations, how you can actually innovate and what the kind of thing that we can create in Asia when your data is basically secured or actually or you basically work on it, and that you made it available and connected. And finally, we're going to wrap up all of that with actual innovation in the region. So without further ado, let's look at what they call the economy in Southeast Asia. And what made me come personally to Singapore 3 years ago is that the region is definitely on an amazing growth. And especially actually the internet economy. If we look at this very simple graph, you can see that according to Google, Temasek and Brain, and a report made in 2019, the internet penetration is accelerating actually, doubling from 2015 to 2019 and expected to triple by 2025. And those numbers were before the pandemic. So you might expect some adjustments, but we also know that this past year was basically a shortcut toward digital transformation. So that might be even more than that. The other interesting point in the region, in the Asia specifically, is how digital savvy is the population. Despite being online more and more at an incredible pace, they are actually quite digital native. From my company point of view, as an e-commerce platform, we started to diversify the way we connect with the population through, for example, live streaming. Obviously, we're simply a marketplace that just resell what the sellers put online. But we realized that putting those channels mobile first, streaming first, where people can interact, can talk to each other, can comment, buy, and so on, actually made them much more involved into the platform and is very receptive from the population. So if we take a few numbers, those two especially are very interesting. We had a few weeks back our shopping festival, 11/11 campaign, and we had 11 million people across the region watching Laz Live, so our live streaming platform. I think that it's not the heart of our business. This is an incredible way to connect with them and something quite specific to the region if you compare to Europe. And the second thing is that even if we are a very mature business and a very big company, we had a 380% year-on-year GMV growth. And you might think it's just bragging, but it's not. It's very relevant to the region. It's very actually showing up what's happening in the region. And the last bit I want to highlight is the GDP growth forecast. And this one was actually taken into account with the pandemic. And it was very strong in 2019 with 5.2%. And despite obviously very hard 2020, the region is expected to rebound quite amazingly at plus 6%. And it shows you that in addition to be quite strong, actually the economy is also very resilient, which is quite optimistic for the years to come, despite the gloomy current situation. So all of this is pretty optimistic to put a frame under what innovations is. But just to recall, there are a few challenges to keep in mind also when we're going to talk about policies. One is political stability. We're going to talk about governments, but the relationship between governments and what is, for example, happening right now in Thailand are things to consider whenever you think about business growth or how policies are put into place. The second thing is the consumers are changing really fast, and that's a two-edged word. Obviously, they are emerging from poverty. They are accessing credit cards. They have more spending power and so on. But that means that what you build for the one generation won't necessarily work for the next one. And all the businesses need to adapt to this pace of changes. And the third thing is the regional diversity. I've been talking so far to things which is pretty much common across the countries in SEA, but the culture, the behaviors, everything is very much specific to each country. And if I take the example of where I work, we have a strategy for each country. And when you talk about companies in Singapore who try to expand their business across the region, they basically all agree that the secret is to be adaptable and to make sure that you understand your local market. And the way you're going to sell something in Thailand, it's going to be very different from the way you've been developing in Singapore or in Indonesia. And that's a challenge to adapt, obviously. And finally, the US-China tariff is no secret. And despite maybe the recent changes, which made things a little bit more optimistic, obviously everybody is keeping a close eye on how the relationship between US and China is going to play out. Because when you look at Singapore, which is a global hub, very depending on global trade, it's going to significantly impact how things work out. So with all that in mind, with all this framing about strong economy and quite local challenges, let's dive into the actual topic of the day. Let's dive into data policies and trends. And the first one I want to look into is how the countries in SEA are actually protecting data and how the governments are putting policies in place to protect consumers' data. And why we need to do it actually. And why do I start by that? The first thing is that the first, I think, very obvious thing to say that we are willing as consumers to give away our data. We need to give away our address to have delivery. We need to give away some personal information to have good recommendations. And for services and for convenience, we are very willing to do that. And businesses are obviously willing to take it. But it brings a few threats. Maybe business can abuse this data. Maybe they can collect things they don't need to make money you don't expect them to do. Or it can be stolen and end up into malicious hands. And I think that's really the two axes we want to look into today. How your data can be abused by the business, which is expected to be normally acting well, and how it can actually be stolen and misused. And that's where government play a role and try to fill a few goals. Especially, they can try to regulate how data is stored and who can access it. They can regulate that everything is done so that by default, it's private and protected, and only for reasonable reason, it's going to be accessed by the relevant systems or people. Secondly, it can enforce how data is protected. And we're going to see a little bit more how they do it, how more specifically it's been done. The third thing is how individuals are identifiable. And what I mean by that is that you can actually build many services by keeping things anonymized, for example. This is especially true in modern analytics, where you can drive conclusions and run analysis information and personal data, because what you mean in the end is insight about your business. And it's very important to identify that there are information which are PII, personal identifiable information, which means they need to be more secured than other information that maybe are not linked to people and to private life. And the way that's going to be regulated would be different. And finally, they need to ensure that whoever business or individual that keep data and record things give control to the consumer. They need to be able to give their consent when the data is collected, or be able to retrieve the data when they need it, or the infamous right to be forgotten that is in Europe, but also in Asia, and request the deletion of the data online. And that's something very hard to look into, but that's something expected by many, many consumers as data become more prevalent. And when you try to reach those goals, to smash those goals, I believe in the region currently, we see countries going through 3 stages, where the first one would be to protect your privacy. If you look at Cambodia, Myanmar, or Indonesia, they don't have a comprehensive data law protection, but they do have usually put in place for many years that's going to ensure that your privacy as a citizen is respected. And I think that's where you want things to get started. You want to be sure that your government is looking after your privacy, and that it won't be too invasive from businesses who don't need it. Then you can go a little bit further, and we can see that Vietnam and actually Indonesia soon are passing new laws to cover for more use cases, where they're gonna acknowledge that businesses need more access to data, and where they try to cover all the cases we can expect today. For example, we can expect that there are recommendation systems, we have analytics that run, and all those things require data. And what they try to do is, again, let those businesses access it while ensuring that the consumer is only giving away necessary information. And I think when you get that in place, when your laws is protecting you, you can go even one step further, which might be the third stage, where we find Philippines and Singapore. And that's where you strike a very interesting balance between empowering the business with a good legal framework to use the data, connected with third parties, transported to partners, while still making sure for consumers that they have control, that it's secured, and so on. Let me be more specific and zoom in a little bit on those 3 stages with examples. If we look at Indonesia, they state in 28 that the use of personal information through IT requires consent. And remember, this is privacy, and that's where to get started. But things get interesting when you try to have more control over that. And Vietnam, for example, in 2019, made it mandatory for businesses to store Vietnam citizen data in Vietnam. And if you have a service that they are using, you should have an office in Vietnam so that you can actually surrender the data to authorities, for example. And that's something very specific to Vietnam, but you can see how locally they try to take back control at government level to make sure that the businesses can still operate and develop while protecting citizen data. And finally, the third stage in Philippines had this very interesting enforcement where entities must have a security program. And I found this example interesting because a security program is a constraint. As a business, this is not something that's going to bring you money, but it's a win-win because it's going to avoid you to lose money. Because as we saw at the beginning, you're going to be under attack. You're going to be under threats for this data that you store about your consumers. And at the same time, your consumers want the data to be secured. So actually forcing and maybe helping businesses to have security program is a way to help business develop in a sustainable way and a way for consumers to trust them. And that's probably the way and where you want to be. And you can just note that this is part of the Data Privacy Act voted in 2012. So it's quite amazing to see how Philippines has been leading the charge somehow on those data laws issues. But again, there are a few challenges to go through these stages. All of them are converging toward the protection of the consumer data. In different ways, Vietnam has a very specific approach. Philippines has a few other things, but all of them are facing some very common challenges in the region. The first one is that the region is facing new things. The people are coming online is a new thing. The pace at which the economy is changing is new and bring new cases that we have little experience to deal with. So they have to come up with solutions which are pretty new. Second thing is awareness. If you want to start changing things, you need to be aware that there are threats, that there are risks, that there are business opportunities and so on. The third thing is education. Actually, you need to onboard people that there are security threats, that their data might be stolen or might be misused, and that they want to do something about it. And the government needs to be aware that there are also business opportunities to provide this legal framework to support them. And once you get all of that in place, actually you need to enforce the new laws. And I can take the example of Vietnam that requires businesses to have an office in Vietnam. How do you entitle foreign companies, for example, to comply with this? How do you make sure that they comply with your local framework? How do you help them as well? Sometimes it can be difficult when you want to expand in the region to be compliant with both Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore, and so on. So it's both enforcement to people who may not be so willing to, but sometimes it's also helping out those who want to. And I hope that gives you kind of a good overview of, I think, how they try to protect data in the region through laws and through regulations, especially through government, obviously. And when you get that into place, when you have this framework that supports your company and your consumers, then you can start open up the data and leverage it. It's not only about protection, it's not only about avoiding the worst, it's about actually using this data for your business and for the benefit of your citizens. And let's look at Singapore and Philippines. Singapore is very much what I would call the data-driven government. And for many years now, actually, they've been bringing data into the heart of the digital government. And what that means, specifically, if you look at this schema, is that they try to make data easily accessible for all the agencies to foster innovation, that any of them can actually share information, so that they can build new things, so that they can innovate. And you can see that they have a trusted center, a place where, which is a source of truth, a data hub as an interface, and all the agencies can leverage data for innovations. And we're going to see how. Philippines is doing it as well. Philippines is a very, very strong statistics entity to support the development of the government. And one thing very interesting you can see on this map is that they realized very early on that geospatial data was very important when conducting surveys. And they wanted to make sure that whenever they were collecting information from citizens or for businesses from places, they were having a comprehensive coverage of the zone, that any decision they would take would be actually very mindful of all the different components. And very early on, they've been integrating geospatial enabled devices whenever they were basically collecting surveys. And that's all this data is actually made publicly available. And as the government upon it, the citizen can also actually consult the data and explore it, all the data sets collected to understand the direction of the country, which I think is a very interesting place to build some critical thinking on how your government is doing. And actually that would be hard of discussion. The countries in Asia signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, which brings basically in a nutshell the largest trade agreement, free trade agreement in the world. And there are many things to say, but I'm just going to focus on one thing: electronic commerce. And I'm just going to quote it: online consumer protection, online personal information protection, transparency, paperless trading, acceptance of electronic signatures, and commitment of cross-border data flows. And that's the framework they're going to build and activate next year for companies from countries from China to Singapore to Korea to Australia, New Zealand, and so on. And that's very, as someone who works in e-commerce, that's just a fantastic news. So there are a few tech details going on. If you want to get there, you need to have standards for countries to talk to each other, for systems to talk to each other. You need to have standards. You need your data to be discoverable. If you want people to look into it, they need to know where to look for. You need a strong infrastructure. You need your country to have strong data centers, internet speed, internet coverage, and so on. And finally, you need to trust your data and be able to know where it comes from, how it's defined, and so on. And finally, you need to feed the humans in the process, because whatever tech and policy you put into it, you need to be empathic to understand why you protect data in the first place. You need awareness, like we said, and changes, but you also need education, and you need education for also. As Singapore is going into upskilling its population in data science and many new areas that they believe is going to be the world of tomorrow. And this is actually true for Vietnam as well, that just realized that all the data that has been collected is just not yet leveraged to its full potential. And that's really what now a lot of countries are looking into. And why they are looking into that is actually for innovations. What kind of innovation? Let's look at Singapore and SingPass, for example. All your personal data centralized across agencies. And remember, that's part of their data-driven organization and the architecture I just showed. Whenever I connect to a governmental service, my data is pre-filled. And this is convenience for me. And that's also because I trust them to be mindful about the data and to keep it secured. And about this privacy thing, let me introduce the token you can see on the right. And this is key into the contact tracing, which has been very successful in Singapore fight against coronavirus. And this token, when presented by the tech team, they spent quite some time explaining that no GPS coordinate is collected and no personal data is collected. Only the ID of the token and who you have been in contact with is reported to the system so that they don't need actually your personal information. And that's very mindful of them to provide something that solves the solution without collecting unnecessary information that could be a threat if stolen or misused. And again, let's stay in Singapore for just a minute and look at this robot that used to walk around in the park and, thanks to image processing, identify people that were breaking safe distancing and warn them to be mindful about it and to be careful about it. And I think it's quite amazing as we see that infections are just spreading around the world. We can expect more robots like cleaning up the MRT or these kind of things happening and automating what used to be maybe agents. And it's very interesting as an innovation, but it needs to also remain extremely mindful of how it's being used, especially when we talk about image processing or AI and so on. How the public is going to relate to this, and how the AI is actually taking decisions is very important to keep in mind. And to give just two lenses to look through when we think about AI and regulation, I would think about data ethics, which is a rising thing, I think, where basically people are told that when they have access to data, they need to be very mindful about the usage of it. And the line can be blurred about how you do that. And because government is sometimes catching up on this, they might be a little bit late into putting laws in place. And it comes down to individuals and companies to be ethics about their usage of the data. And usually it's going to pay off on how your consumer is going to appreciate it. And the other thing is the explainable AI, which is something I really quite close to my heart and that I'm pretty glad to see as a rising star, I think, among very smart people. As we see AI taking more decisions in crime, in healthcare, in decisions making, it can be extremely important to actually justify those decisions and make them explainable. And this is something very hard to achieve, but which is, I mean, we start to see more and more studies and interesting things coming out. And we can, I think, this is something we're going to hear a lot in the coming years. And finally, all of that actually impact the business. And when we follow this openness of data and this connectivity of data, we have concrete example of things happening right now in Asia. And I'm thinking about open banking, for example, at the corporate level. So we know that banks will be required to be so that they can actually communicate to each other and make things easier. And it just triggers a whole lot of new startup into the fintech world. But as you can see, central banks in Singapore and Philippines are also collaborating and using it to fight money laundering or this kind of cross-border issues. And ourselves in Lazada have been partnering up, for example, with Citibank to share data between our consumers so that they can benefit from it. And if they use their Citi card to purchase on Lazada, they're going to have discounts. And that's how you get a win-win-win between two businesses and consumers. And I'm just going to finish this part on a question mark. In 2017, McKinsey company predicted that 50% of the work activities could be automated in SEA. And that's a disruption if that happens, obviously. But at the same time, this is the role of the government to just make sure that some low wages jobs are just around to just let people climb the social ladder. And I don't think those 50% of jobs are going to change overnight. But I think everybody agrees that there is an increasing demand for automation and new skills. And many countries, like I mentioned, Singapore, for example, are upskilling their workforce to just prepare for that. And again, if it's not overnight, that might be soon that we have more AI and where the skills will probably shift from maybe more manual jobs toward different engineering skills or different expectations. Which brings us to just the final part. I think we've seen so far quite a few things, how we protect the data in the region across many of the countries in Southeast Asia. We saw that once you got your data protected, you can actually leverage it to empower businesses. And we saw a few innovations on how that happens. So we basically saw that your infrastructure, when you're in Singapore and you provide some very strong internet speed, some very good coverage, when Vietnam invests a lot in data centers, you give the backbone in the region to just skyrocket internet penetration and business development. And when people are aware of this and governments are aware of it, they can put the policies in place so that this development, this growth actually happens in a legal framework that protects the consumers. The second thing is to connect data and to allow this partnership. So it goes through a bit of tech, obviously, but it goes also through a secured framework and the willingness of businesses to build those connections and the willingness of government to leverage the data they collect. And that happens when you skill up your people. And maybe your CEO just needs to be aware of, how to read the dashboard. And maybe you need some people to learn SQL and coding. But you don't necessarily need to go that way. You certainly need to have some kind of data literacy at any point of your career that you can also, at your personal level, leverage it. And all of that brings you to innovation. And I'm just going to give you 3 more examples on how regionally we see this happening. And the first one is something we do at Lazada and in logistics, and not only in Lazada. And I can't show you the right thing. It's a map of New York, but this is pretty much something we've been doing for the past years. As you can see on the left, we have a heat map of the failed deliveries or the volume of deliveries we have, and that lets our operations optimize where to invest in infrastructure, where to invest on better services, and so on. And I think a lot of established companies are going that way, optimizing their frameworks, optimizing their operations, and they are leveraging data to do so. On the bottom right, you can see how Singapore built pretty much in a weekend, actually, an application to automate your interactions with the government when you enter the country and you are under quarantine. And this small application is just making sure that the process is automated, secured, and the country remains safe from the COVID. And the last example is actually from Kepler, a company which works in data transparency for commodity markets. And you can see how AI signals, port authorities, which are public data, is actually aggregated to provide a comprehensive market overview of commodity market. And that's a way to provide huge values for businesses from public information. And it's quite amazing how the right technology and the right execution can actually give governments and companies as huge as Shell or ExxonMobil fantastic value from just at the heart data aggregation. And that's really key, I think, to realize that between AI and data and statistics, all of that is really in its infancy and getting started. So I hope we started to answer, and that you will have more insights into the region on how we protect users while enabling businesses. I hope you saw that we are basically creating innovative solutions in ACA and probably in many other countries, while still respecting and be mindful about the privacy of the users. And when you get that right, which is pretty hard, you actually enter a very successful cycle where you can foster innovation in a very sustainable way. And I'm very much looking forward to the coming years and how together we're gonna, in the data field especially, we're gonna play our role into that. So thanks for listening to me and really looking forward to that. Thanks.